keyboard or controller? That is the question. For those of you who love controller, you'll argue it's harder to edit on controller, and that keyboard and mouse is nothing but point and click. And for those of you who love keyboard, you're going to argue that aim assist is quite overpowered, and it's a lot harder to get used to keyboard than it is a controller. And the reality is, you can go back and forth on this, and I'm not really sure there is a right answer. My goal in this video series is to figure out which is harder and why. I'm a keyboard player transitioning over to a PlayStation 5 controller, and I want to document my experiences and figure out what's difficult, what's easy, and how the whole thing goes. And maybe making the transition easier for someone who's thinking about making the change themselves. First and foremost, it has to be recognized that playing on controller is a completely different world than playing on keyboard and mouse. The way you move, the way you aim, the vibe, the speed at which you play, the way you look around, it's like you're genuinely playing a different game, which is part of the reason why I'm so excited to do this. When you can simply just change the input of a game and it feels like a whole new experience, and it feels like you're getting a whole new lifespan out of it. And as someone who has over 10,000 hours in this game already, I feel like that's something I have to at least try. And maybe it has a little bit to do with my childhood and how much I love playing video games growing up. And maybe it's just me, but I can't help but feel playing on controller makes me feel like a kid again. Growing up, I was absolutely addicted to sports, video games, and making money. And when I wasn't playing sports or playing video games, I was making money to buy more video games. I can remember walking around my neighborhood, knocking on every single door. Can I rake your yard? Can I pick up your pine cones? Can I have some money, baby? Let me do some work for you, baby. Employ me. And my dad loved PC games, so it kind of made me a hybrid gamer. With him, I played games like Red Alert, Command & Conquer, Age of Empires, Soldier of Fortune. I should not have been allowed to play that at that age. And Duke Nukem. Memory unlock. I just remember when I was like 12 years old, I used to like flirt with this girl through Yahoo who I met on the game, and she used to like say she was in love with me and I loved her, but then she was like 16. Maybe I should keep that one to myself. And let's be real, remember how awesome it was to play things as a child? So if I'm channeling my inner child through this controller and I get to experience Fortnite as a child using a controller, sign me up. Now, before we start going into gameplay and my journey itself, I think it'd be smart for us to break down the actual differences between the two inputs. And sorry, Azron users, we're not talking about you today. We don't like your kind around here. Now, the primary difference between the two is their input methods themselves. Keyboards use keys, which are based off of digital inputs, which means they either are on or they're off, while controllers use buttons, triggers, and analog sticks based off an analog input, which is a continuous non-stop signal. Think about it. Clicking buttons, holding down the trigger, are always moving around the analog stick. One is always giving information, one is start stop. You get it now. And that is the foundation of where all their differences start from. That and the fact that they're like completely different when you hold and they're completely different. Keyboard and mouse is all about precision. The mouse, point and click, the keyboard, on, off. Everything's set up in a grid-like fashion. Everything's meant to be precise and immediate. And with this directional movement style, it's more discreet and a little bit less fluid than a controller necessarily would be. On the opposite end of the spectrum, controllers provide fluid movement through rotating analog sticks, which move in circular rotations. This analog control creates for variable movement and directional speed that gives so many controller players that movement that feels like butter. Nice. And typically a major con with controllers is that they have very limited button mapping, meaning that there's only a specific amount of different layouts. But with Fortnite, you can literally make any button do anything, which is a major W, which removes a major competitive advantage that the keyboard has over the controller. When it comes to editing and building, most agree it's much more precise and easy on the keyboard and mouse. The combination of the point and click with editing and the massive amount of combinations that you can use to set up your keybinds allows for a major advantage with building and editing on the keyboard and mouse. But the difficulty there is with so many options, it can be very difficult to figure out what works best for you. As there's so many options, what works best for me is not going to work best for you. My hands are massive. Your hands probably aren't.
What do you mean by that?
Anyone who's used both inputs understands how much easier it is to point a mouse right onto something than it is to have two rotating joysticks line up on something. With controller, you have to take both your hands and line up two different analog sticks and match up all these different buttons just to get a few things done. It is indeed much more difficult. But anyone who's used both inputs knows how smooth and butter-like it is to do these things on keyboard once you figure out the process and get the muscle memory down. Again, the theme here seems to be that controllers are much easier to use at the start, but much harder to master. As for the keyboard and mouse, much harder at the start, but once you get to the mastery level, much easier to kind of get there. Now, aim assist has to be the biggest point of contention when it comes to this debate. Keyboard players argue that it's way too powerful and does way too much for them, while controller players argue pointing and clicking is the easiest thing you can do. Both are kind of right, both are kind of wrong. If you've ever played Fortnite with no aim assist on controller, you recognize you cannot hit the broadside of a barn. It is that difficult.
You missed that one. Try another.
Controller players would average a 0 KD if they went into lobbies against PC players. But we can also admit the aim assist sometimes kicks on a little heavily and we're thinking, maybe am I cheating? The reality here though is if aim assist did not exist at some level, there would be no such thing as crossplay because no one would play these games that had crossplay because again, they would have no chance to be run over by the PC crowd.
I I quit!
Pause. If you've made it this far into the episode, make sure to hit that subscription button. Come on, man. It really makes a difference. Oh, and the like button too, please. Inventory management, while being one of the most underrated aspects of this game, is one of the most important, especially in a game where milliseconds determine who wins a fight. If you're well organized and can access a weapon in one click, you have a major advantage over someone who has to cycle over to it. That's not even debatable. I cannot tell you how many people I've made quit using the scroll button to go to their weapons while playing on mouse and keyboard. This is one of the biggest disadvantages. Not only are you going to scroll past it sometimes, it's just not the quickest way to do it. There's nothing quicker than just boom, go to your shotgun. E is my shotgun. Just practice switching directly to your weapons. It saves lives. Trust me. On controller, it's much more difficult to cycle through your weapons using the bumpers. There's no denying that, which is why it's so important on how your loadout is set up. You need to have your SMG next to your shotgun, your AR next to your sniper, your spray weapon next to your shotgun. It needs to be one click away. And if you have paddles, that means you need to map it out to where one of your triggers always goes straight to your shotgun. The general consensus when it comes to the learning curve, the skill ceiling with controllers and keyboards, is that the controller is much easier to use at the start.
I like you, but you're crazy.
It's much more inclusive, much more straightforward, and is much more commonly used in society for gaming than the keyboard. But once you start to get to that level of insane at the game, to be able to do all those things at such a high pace, it becomes very difficult in this weird fashion. But with the keyboard, much more difficult at the start. In fact, many people quit because it can be that frustrating. But once you start to get the hang of it, you can really start to increase your skill very quickly. Because again, it's so much repetition, and it's all just right there at your fingertips. And this is one of those things that will vary from person to person. Not everyone's going to be as good on keyboard as they are controller. It's just the way things are. We're all different. It depends what you value and what you're good at. When it comes to comfort, it seems like the controller has a major edge here. You can literally be upside down and still use a controller. That's comfort. And the way controllers are set up ergonomically, they're made so you don't experience hand fatigue. They want you playing their game for long periods of time. But if you're playing on keyboard and mouse, there's really only so many different positions you can play in. Whether you're a wrist player or an elbow player, after a certain amount of time, you start to feel worn out. Not to mention, many people can't stand up and play on keyboard and mouse like they can with a controller. Standing desks, while awesome, are not mandatory. So if you know anybody who wants to sponsor us with a standing desk, please let me know. The culture war between keyboard and mouse and controllers will forever rage on. There will always be a divide in every single thing in culture. Cool kids play console and nerds play PC, right? Well, maybe in the early 2000s, 2010s, that was the case, but it seems like after 2020, everyone is moving into PCs. I mean, honestly, that might have been the biggest year for PC gaming since maybe the release of World of Warcraft. It was the only time in history it was cheaper to buy a pre-build than it was to build your own computer. That was crazy. I paid $2,000 for my 3080 Ti. Oh, don't remind me. Enough though, within the Fortnite community, there does seem to be this little bit of extra respect for someone who's really good at the game, who's also on controller. Because most people do recognize it is very difficult to be that good on controller. But if you're that good on both keyboard and controller, oh, the respect, it's insane. People recognize how much time you have to put in on just one of them to be good, let alone both. And if you're good on both in both zero builds and builds, oh, legendary. I think this is a pretty good stopping point. Next episode, we'll jump into my gameplay. We'll start talking about the differences I noticed and see how good I do. And before you forget, hit that subscription button and turn on noties. I'm really excited for this, and I can't wait to see you on the next episode.